Throughout history, human beings have been stranded in desperate situations where they have had to eat human flesh to survive. Here are some of the most harrowing tales. However, there are those who have chosen to eat human beings out of preference rather than desperation. Gaining a grisly reputation, those who choose cannibalism out of desire rather than necessity have been shunned from the community. That being said, there have been communities in which cannibalism has been an accepted part of the religious and cultural practice. Some of these societies still exist today, living deep within the forests. The Korowai of New Guinea are an example of a tribe that professes to still practice cannibalism. Historically, the Aztecs stands out as a culture that practices religious ritual cannibalism, eating the bodies of sacrificial victims. There are also those who have been forced into cannibalism not out of custom or perverted desire, but by sheer circumstance. In these stories, the victims are also those who have had to resort to eating human flesh. Here are 5 of those stories. Number 1. Cannibalism in Andes. One of the most famous incidents in the modern times is the harrowing tale of the Uruguayan rugby team whose plane crashed high in the Andes. On October 13, 1972, the team was on its way to Chile when the flight crashed into a snowy mountain. Of the 45 people on board, 29 survived the initial horror. But things could only get worse. The ordeal that followed could last 72 days. In the high altitude of the Andes, starvation sets in quickly, and after a few days, one of the survivors picked up a shardy glass and began slicing off bits of flesh from one of their comrades' buttocks. It was clear that they could have to resort to cannibalism in order to survive. The pilot had died in the crash, and the survivors ate him first, as they had no emotional connection to him, but soon they were having to eat their friends too. Soon after, they found a transistor radio and learned that the search effort had been called off. After an avalanche struck and killed 8 more of the survivors, it was decided that a team could go out to find rescue. 2 men set out west in the direction of Chile. They trekked to the nearest peak, a monumental task on its own, but there was no sign of civilization from their vantage point. Resigned to their fate, they climbed down, assured that they would die. They heard the sound of the rushing water and found a river. By the river, they found an empty soup can, a horseshoe, a herd of cows, and finally a man on horseback. Chilean military helicopters were dispatched, and on December 22nd, 16 survivors were rescued. In 1993, a film called Alive was released that portrayed the event of the ordeal. Number 2. The crew of Essex. In November 1820, the whaling ship Essex had found good hunting ground in the Pacific. The small boat were out hunting when an 85-foot sperm whale made directly the Essex, ramming the ship twice and causing irreplaceable damage. The decision was made to abandon the ship, and in a bizarre and ironic turn of fate, they decided to head south instead of the nearest island, as they believed the latter could be inhabited by cannibals. The crew piled into the boats and left the sinking Essex behind. Salt water saturated the bread, and the scorching sun beat down on them unmercifully. After 2 weeks, they spotted Henderson Island, but it was barren. Still, 3 crew members decided to stay on the island rather than to climb back into the boats. A storm struck, and Owen Chase's boat got separated. After eating one of their dead crewmates, they were rescued by a British brig. The other 2 boats fared worse. One of the boat's 3 men were eaten before the 2 remaining boats were separated. They drew straws to see who could be shot and eaten. Poland ended up eating his own cousin. When they were finally rescued, only 2 men remained, one of which was Pollard. The men were crazed from their ordeal and barely registered that they were being rescued when the American whaler Daffy showed up. They continued stacking on bones as they drew near the ship, and when they were pulled aboard, they shoved bones into their pockets. The 3 men who stayed on Henderson Islands were later rescued, and the survivors of the incident were reunited. In 2015, a movie retelling the harrowing story In the Heart of the Sea was released. Number 3. The Donner Party. In 1846, a group of American pioneers headed west under the captaincy of George Donner. They decided to take a shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff across the Sierra Nevada on the advice of an unreliable guide named Lansford Hastings. The Donner Party decided to press on through the route without heeding a warning to the contrary. The shortcut turned out to be 125 miles longer than had been claimed, and it ran through extreme inhospitable terrain. 7 members of the Donner Party reached the Great Salt Lake Desert, the crossing of which caused the loss of dozens of cattle. Several wagons had to be abandoned. By the time the party had reached the end of the Hastings Cutoff, they were racing against time as winter was approaching. Winter hit hard, and the Donner Party was trapped in Sierra Nevada. With heavy snow falling without respite, the cattle wandered off and were lost, leaving the members of the party to starve. In desperation, a group of 10 men and 5 women left the party to try and find help. 8 of the men died en route, but the survivors managed to get through to California and rally help, but not after having roasted and eaten meat from the bodies of the fallen. 2 of the hikers, Native Americans, had refused to eat the bodies of the dead. They ran off but were hunted down, shot in the head and eaten. 42 members of the Donner Party died, and around half of the survivors had resorted to cannibalism. Number 4. The Raft of Medusa. In 1816, the French frigate Medusa ran around 100 kilometers off the coast of Mauritania. The crew numbered around 400, but there was only space for 250 people in the lifeboats. The remaining men and women attempted to make the journey to the Africa coast via a large raft. Initially, the lifeboat towed the raft, and after only a few miles, someone made the fateful decision to cut the ropes, and the raft was set adrift. Rations on the raft were meager. The only food was a bag of biscuit, which was consumed on the first day. Stormy weather threatened, and waves rolled over the side of the raft, dragging helpless victims to their doom. Others were killed in fighting while trying to get to the center. By the 4th day, only 67 crew members remained. Starving and driven to madness, the survivors resorted to cannibalism, murdering and butchering their comrades. On the 8th day, the strongest of the survivors threw the weakest into the sea, leaving only 15 men on the raft. They survived another 15 days before being accidentally found by a brig called the Argus. Number 5. Cannibalism and the settlement of Jamestown. The early years of settlement in the Americans were not kind to the colonizers. The settlement of Johnson struggled as it suffered from starvation through the first winters. Of the 104 families that founded the colony, only 38 survived the first winter. The winter of 1609 was the worst, and this period in Jamestown history was known as the starving time. The colonists had come to rely on supply ships, and when the cargo ship was lost at the sea, anything that could be eaten was eaten. Horses, dogs, cats, rats, and mice were the first victims. People ate boats and straps of leather. Finally, the inhabitants turned to cannibalism. Human history is rife with events that have led to cannibalism, from our earliest ancestors to the modern day. In those instances where survival is at stake, those who have eaten human flesh often struggle with the moral dilemma of what they have had to do. As humans continue to explore, progress, and take risks, there will be no doubt that cases of cannibalism will be there in the future. I hope you have enjoyed this channel. Remember to subscribe, like, and comment.